Listen closely. Imagine a whole nation, millions of minds, all walking toward a cliff led by a single familiar voice. Why didn't they stop? Was it fear, or something deeper? A psychological gravity that chained them to a terrible fate? Tonight, we'll turn down the noise and delve into the human mind's most dangerous secret. The compelling, almost hypnotic need to obey, even when obedience becomes a sentence. As the world outside grows quiet, we begin our study of obedience psychology and the rise of authoritarian leaders. The siren song of certainty. A world on the brink. Imagine a time when the world feels like a shaking, noisy place. Maybe your home is gone, your job vanished, and tomorrow feels like a dark puzzle. This is what happened to many nations before they followed a terrible leader. They were standing on the brink. When people feel lost and confused, their minds don't want freedom. They want certainty. They want a strong hand to point to the map and say, "Go this way. This is safe." This longing for a simple, clear answer in a confusing world is the first step toward mass obedience. It's the moment when a population trades their complex problems for a single, powerful promise. The leaders who take power during these shaky times don't offer complicated solutions. They offer a guarantee. They speak loudly and simply, telling people who to blame and what to believe. This is incredibly comforting when your life feels out of control. Think of it like a dark room. The tyrant is the person who brings a single, bright spotlight, telling everyone to stop worrying about the darkness and just look at the light. The light might blind them in the end, but for a moment it feels like safety. This psychological comfort is a powerful drug against the pain of uncertainty and social chaos. History shows us this pattern repeatedly. After a massive war like World War I, or during a terrible money crisis like the Great Depression, people felt truly abandoned. The old rules and old leaders seemed to have failed completely. Their faith in things like democracy, banks and peace treaties crumbled. When everything fails, a strong voice promising a complete restart, a perfect new world, sounds irresistible. It's a message that says, "You suffered enough. Now I will make it right." This promise of a clean slate is crucial for an authoritarian regime to gain its. This surrender to certainty is a subtle shift. It starts with small compromises. People start to give up their right to question or debate because debating feels exhausting, and questioning only brings back the uncertainty they are trying to escape. They begin to think, maybe it's better if one strong man decides everything. Maybe that will bring the stability we crave. This silent agreement to trade their individual thoughts for collective peace is a key psychological surrender. The leaders use this apathy, this tiredness, to build their cult of personality brick by silent brick. The terrible leader is a master at reading this desperate need. They don't just promise stability, they create a feeling of national destiny. They tell the nation they are special, chosen, and have a unique, important mission in the world. This gives every person who follows them a feeling of purpose. Suddenly their suffering is not pointless, it's a necessary part of a grand story. This feeling of being part of something great and historic is a profound psychological reward that locks in their loyalty. It moves them from simply obeying to actively believing. So the nations didn't follow these leaders because they were evil people. They followed them because they were terrified, exhausted people who craved a fixed point in a spinning universe. The leader became the fixed point. It's a tragic, repeating story of how social anxiety and a profound loss of faith can open the door to tyranny. The siren song wasn't the sound of evil. It was the comforting sound of a simple, certain answer. We'll explore this further as we drift into the depths of mass psychology tonight. The Milgram paradox. Just following orders. Hello again. Tonight we're going to discuss a famous and sometimes scary idea called the Milgram experiment. Imagine a kind scientist in a white coat asking you to do something that hurts another person. He's not shouting, he's just calmly saying, Please continue. The experiment requires it. In the 1960s, a man named Stanley Milgram wanted to see how far ordinary people would go to obey authority. The surprising and often chilling result showed that most people would keep following orders, even when they thought they were causing great pain. The key to the experiment wasn't fear of punishment from the scientist. The key was the feeling of legitimacy. The scientist was in a respected university, wearing a uniform, the white coat, and speaking with an air of knowledge. When the person being tested felt uncomfortable, they would look to the scientist. Once the authority figure took the responsibility for the action, the normal person felt released from their own moral guilt. They weren't bad people. They were just a tool of a greater authority. This idea, the Milgram paradox, is vital to understanding how terrible leaders work. The leader doesn't need every person to be a monster. They just need a chain of normal, responsible people who are willing to do small, harmful tasks because a person in a uniform or high office told them to. This chain allows terrible acts to happen on a huge scale without one single person feeling fully guilty. They can always say, "I was just following orders." Think about the everyday people who carried out cruel policies in history. They weren't always passionate believers in the terrible leader's ideas. They were clerks, train drivers, secretaries, and soldiers. For them, the authority of the state structure was more powerful than their individual conscience. This is the psychology of obedience, the tendency to defer to power because it's easier and safer than standing up and taking personal responsibility for stopping the flow of events. The experiment teaches us that the desire for order can sometimes outweigh the desire for justice. When a system is established, with clear rules and a clear chain of command, people naturally tend to flow with it. The Milgram effect shows that our conscience is often weaker than our learned habit of respect for authority. This habit is taught to us from childhood by our parents, teachers, and police. The terrible leader just needs to hijack this natural social learning. The person obeying often feels a huge amount of stress and conflict. They want to stop, but the voice of authority is steady and insistent. Continue. For a nation under a tyrant, the state itself becomes that calm, insistent voice. The people feel trapped, but the simple act of continuing to obey seems like the only way out of their psychological conflict. It's not a willing evil. It's a profound, sometimes tragic, failure of individual courage in the face of perceived legitimate power. This is the quiet truth of mass compliance, the banality of evil, Eichmann and the normalization. It's time to talk about a very difficult idea, the normalization of evil. When we think of bad leaders, we think of raging, monstrous figures, but sometimes the greatest evils are carried out by people who seem completely normal, even boring. This idea became famous after the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a key organizer of the Holocaust. A philosopher named Hannah Arendt watched his trial and described his actions as the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a screaming fanatic. He was a bureaucrat. He cared about schedules, paperwork, and efficient logistics. His job was simply to organize train schedules to move people. He saw himself as a very efficient manager. He wasn't fueled by deep hatred. He was fueled by a desire to do his job well and follow the procedures set by his superiors. He was a cog in a huge, terrible machine, and he focused only on his small part. This is a powerful lesson in mass psychology. The terrible leader creates a huge system of laws, forms, and administrative steps. This system takes the personal choice out of cruelty. When people perform a terrible act, they don't see themselves as committing a murder. They see themselves as signing a form, checking a box, or following a directive. The evil is made routine and impersonal. When evil becomes routine, it becomes invisible. It's like a terrible smell that you get used to and no longer notice. The people around Eichmann weren't debating morality. They were debating whether the new train schedule was efficient enough. This focus on procedure and technical details allowed them to completely ignore the massive human cost of their work. They became specialists in their terrible trade, not moral actors. This normalization is how a whole nation can become complicit. If the person at their desk is just filling out a deportation paper and the train engineer is just following a rail schedule, then who is responsible for the overall cruelty? Everyone is, and yet, in their minds, no one feels like they are. The terrible leader cleverly designs a system where the guilt is totally diffused across thousands of small normal actions. The banality of evil teaches us that the greatest danger is not always the madman, but the ordinary man who simply stops thinking and starts following directions without question. It's the lesson that an efficient bureaucracy can be a terrifying weapon when directed by a hateful ideology. It's the simple truth that following rules must always be balanced by thinking about consequences. This is a central truth in the psychology of totalitarianism, the cult of personality, charisma as a weapon. Imagine a spotlight shining on one person, and they look like the strongest, wisest, most perfect person in the whole world. That's the cult of personality. Terrible leaders don't just take power. They manufacture a godlike image of themselves that bypasses their followers' logical thinking. They use charisma not as a charming trait, but as a carefully built psychological weapon to create an emotional, almost religious bond with the masses. This cult doesn't happen by accident. It is meticulously planned. Every photo, every speech, every symbol is designed to make the leader seem larger than life. They are often given special titles: the leader, the great helmsman, the father of the nation. This language is meant to elevate them above normal human criticism. People don't evaluate a god, they worship a god. This makes the leader's words not just political speeches, but sacred directives. The leader becomes a projection of the people's greatest desires. If the nation feels weak, the leader projects overwhelming strength. If the nation feels divided, the leader projects perfect unity. The followers don't see the real, flawed person. They see their own hopes and wishes reflected in the leader's carefully crafted image. This psychological mechanism explains why followers often refuse to believe facts about their leader. They are defending their own dream of stability. To keep this image strong, the leader must be seen everywhere. Huge posters, statues, and images cover the public space. This is a form of visual indoctrination. It creates an environment where the leader's face becomes more familiar and comforting than the faces of your own neighbours. The sheer repetition of the image acts like a gentle, persistent psychological pressure, reminding everyone of the leader's omnipresence and power. The public rallies are a key part of the cult. Surrounded by thousands of others, all shouting the same slogans and feeling the same powerful emotion, the individual feels a temporary loss of self. The crowd becomes one single, overwhelming emotional organism. In this state, doubt disappears, and the feeling of belonging is overwhelmingly powerful. This is where the emotional bond with the authoritarian figure is forged in heat. Ultimately, the cult of personality replaces the idea of the nation with the idea of the leader. To be loyal to the country means to be loyal to him. This is a brilliant psychological move because it makes opposition impossible. To question the leader is to become a traitor to the entire nation and the whole grand project. This tyranny of charisma keeps a whole population locked in a state of emotional and intellectual subservience. The illusion of unity, groupthink, and the echo chamber. Have you ever been in a group where everyone seems to agree, even if you have a nagging doubt in your own mind? That feeling is called groupthink. It's the powerful, often unconscious drive to conform to the group's opinion to maintain harmony and acceptance. Terrible leaders are masters at creating an illusion of perfect national unity that makes any individual doubt feel like a dangerous, shameful disease. The regime creates an echo chamber where only one message is allowed to be heard. The leader is great. The plan is perfect. The nation is united. All other voices are silenced, either through censorship or the simple fear of social rejection. When you hear the same message from the radio, the newspaper, and your neighbours, it becomes incredibly difficult to believe your own dissenting thoughts. You start to think, maybe I am the one who is wrong. This desire to belong is one of the strongest human needs. In a totalitarian state, non-conformity is not just a disagreement, it is an act of social suicide. If you express doubt, you are instantly cast out of the safe, warm circle of the group and become part of the out-group. The fear of being isolated and labelled a traitor or an enemy is a far stronger motivation for obedience than any jail sentence. To enforce this, the state often uses mind guards, people who actively work to prevent negative or doubting information from reaching the group. This can be the government newspaper editor, the local party official, or even just an overly zealous neighbour who reports suspicious talk. The mind guard's job is to protect the collective morale and the illusion of flawless belief. The terrible leader understands that a nation that is constantly debating and questioning is a weak nation. They substitute cohesion for truth. They want the population to prioritize the feeling of togetherness over the difficult work of thinking independently and questioning power. The simple, repetitive slogans are not for information. They are for creating a shared, rhythmic experience that bonds the crowd. So, the followers aren't necessarily convinced by the leader's arguments. They are convinced by the overwhelming pressure of the crowd. They follow the terrible leader because they follow everyone else. It's a tragedy of mass psychological pressure, where individual intellect is simply crushed by the weight of a manufactured, overwhelming national consensus. The comfort of unity, sadly, becomes the key to the nation's imprisonment. The outgroup mechanism, us versus them. Imagine you and your friends are building a very tall, wobbly tower. It's hard work and you start arguing. Suddenly you see another group of kids laughing at you. Immediately you stop fighting with your friends and join together to yell at the other kids. This is the us versus them psychology, and terrible leaders use it to perfection. They manufacture an external enemy, or out-group, to unify the people who follow them, the in-group. The leader knows that shared hatred is a more effective glue than shared love. By focusing the people's frustration and anger onto a small, carefully chosen group, they deflect attention from their own failures. If the economy's bad, it's not the leader's fault. It's the fault of the outsiders or the traitors who are secretly working against the nation. This simple scapegoating is a political magic trick. The outgroup is always portrayed in the simplest, most dehumanizing terms. They are described not as complex people, but as a single abstract threat, a disease, a spy, or an economic poison. This dehumanization is a key step in the psychology of persecution. Once the outgroup is no longer seen as human, the followers can carry out cruel acts without feeling any moral pangs. For the followers, this mechanism provides a huge psychological benefit: clarity. Before, the nation was confused and the problems were complex. Now, the goal is simple: defeat the enemy. The followers feel righteous and purposeful. They are not just obeying a leader, they are saving their nation from a terrible lurking danger. This feeling of being a heroic defender cements their loyalty and commitment. The state uses propaganda to constantly magnify the threat posed by the outgroup. Even small, harmless actions by the outsiders are blown up into massive, dangerous conspiracies. This keeps the nation in a constant state of fear and high alert, which makes them cling even tighter to the strong, protective leader. The leader is the only one who can save them from the danger he created. The us versus them strategy is a dark, powerful truth of mass obedience. It proves that if you give a population an enemy, they will stop fighting among themselves and focus entirely on the new target. This manufactured conflict locks the followers in, making their entire identity dependent on their opposition to the outgroup. This simple division is often the core secret of a totalitarian regime's stability. The road to Weimar. Despair as a political tool. Let's travel back in time to Germany after World War I, a period known as the Weimar Republic. This was a time of almost unimaginable despair and confusion. Germany had lost the war, their economy collapsed, their money became worthless, and the people felt profoundly humiliated and betrayed. This era is a perfect example of how widespread social trauma creates the perfect seedbed for a terrible leader. The people had lost all faith in institutions, the government was weak, democracy seemed slow and chaotic, and the price of a loaf of bread could change every hour. When life becomes this unstable and unpredictable, the human mind cries out for structure and retribution. They weren't looking for a careful politician, they were looking for a saviour who promised to restore their honour and wealth overnight. This collective feeling of national humiliation was a powerful, deep emotion. The terrible leader who arose during this time didn't offer complex economic plans. He offered pride and a simple explanation for their suffering. We were betrayed by internal enemies. He weaponized their shame and anger, turning it into a powerful, destructive political force. Think of a person who has lost everything. They are desperate. In this state of emotional collapse, they are highly susceptible to simple, forceful solutions. The leader offered them a sense of national superiority to replace their deep-seated feelings of worthlessness. This psychological transfer, from personal shame to collective pride, was the engine that drove mass loyalty. The chaos of the Weimar years was deliberately exploited. The leaders didn't want the nation to calm down. They needed the crisis to continue so that their radical, simple solutions would always seem necessary. They portrayed themselves as the only thing standing between the nation and total collapse, effectively making themselves indispensable in the eyes of the exhausted, frightened people. The road to Weimar shows us a painful truth. Despair is a political tool. When a population is traumatized, economically destroyed, and politically abandoned, their rational defenses break down. They will cling to the loudest, most confident voice that promises to end the suffering, no matter how extreme that voice may be. This is the psychology of crisis leading directly to the embrace of authoritarianism. The young pioneers, indoctrination from the cradle. To build a tyranny that lasts, a terrible leader can't just convince the adults, they must capture the minds of the children. This is where systematic indoctrination comes in. In many totalitarian states, children are enrolled in state-run youth organizations, like the Young Pioneers, from a very early age. The goal is to make obedience and loyalty a core part of their identity, a second nature that they never question. The process starts subtly. The children are taught songs, slogans, and stories where the leader is the ultimate hero, the kind, all-knowing father figure. Their textbooks rewrite history, eliminating any inconvenient truths and magnifying the leader's supposed greatness. The world they learn about is one where the leader's system is the only possible system, and all opposition is the work of hidden evil forces. This method uses the powerful psychology of peer pressure and the desire to belong. Being a young pioneer or a similar youth group member means getting special clothes, going on trips, and feeling important. To question the group's beliefs means losing all your friends and being labelled a social outcast. For a child, this threat of isolation is devastatingly effective. The child learns to report on their own family if they hear dissenting opinions. The state replaces the parental authority with the state's authority. This is a terrifying level of control. It breaks the fundamental trust of the family unit and turns every home into a potential observation post for the regime. Loyalty to the leader must come before loyalty to anyone else. The language of the state becomes the only language they know. They learn to automatically recite the slogans and parrot the ideology. This is not about deep understanding, it's about emotional reflex. When challenged, they don't think, they repeat what they have been taught. The state has successfully colonized the young mind by filling it entirely with the required answers. Propaganda's lullaby, the dream of the new reality. Imagine a constant, soothing yet powerful voice telling you a beautiful story. A story of a perfect nation, a glorious future, and a wise leader. This is propaganda's lullaby. It's not just about lying, it's about creating an entirely new reality for the followers, a dream they want to live inside of, designed to overwhelm and replace individual rational perception with the state-sanctioned myth. Propaganda works through repetition and simplicity. Complex truths are replaced with simple, easily memorized slogans. The message is repeated everywhere, on posters, in songs, on every radio show, until it stops being information and starts being the background noise of life. The constant presence makes the lies feel familiar and true simply because they are ubiquitous. The content of the propaganda is carefully designed to appeal to the deepest human emotions: pride, fear, and hope. It tells the people they are the greatest nation on earth: pride. It warns them of terrible hidden enemies: fear. And it always promises that tomorrow everything will be perfect: hope. These emotional appeals bypass the rational, critical part of the brain. Mass rallies are a crucial part of this. Standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others, all shouting the same words, the individual feels submerged into a powerful collective emotion. The huge flags, the dramatic music, the leader's powerful voice, it all works to create a temporary, overwhelming sense of total unity and power. For a time, the propaganda becomes real. This new reality creates what is called a double life. People may know that their actual life is hard and that the promises aren't true, but they learn to separate the two. They live their difficult, real life in private, and they embrace the comforting, powerful, state-approved dream in public. This psychological division protects them from the pain of facing the regime's failures. The power of totalitarian propaganda is not that it makes people believe a particular lie. It's that it destroys their capacity to distinguish truth from fiction. It makes them reliant on the state for their entire understanding of the world. By supplying the people with a constant, beautiful and simplified dream, the terrible leader keeps them asleep, quiet, and perfectly obedient. The Russian famine and the will to believe. Let's look at a particularly harsh historical example: the terrible famines in the Soviet Union, especially in the 1930s. Millions of people starved to death because of the state's brutal policies. Yet, even in the face of this absolute catastrophe, the collapse of their own physical survival, many citizens still clung to their belief in the communist system and its leader. This is the tragic phenomenon known as the will to believe. How could someone continue to be loyal when their own children were starving? The answer lies in the psychology of investment. The followers had invested everything: their past loyalties, their personal sacrifices, and their future hopes into the system. To admit the system was fundamentally wrong would mean admitting that all their suffering and all the deaths were meaningless and unnecessary. The human mind finds meaninglessness profoundly difficult to accept. It is easier, psychologically, to believe that the famine is the result of external sabotage, the work of internal traitors, or a temporary necessary hardship for a glorious future. Anything is easier than accepting the terrible truth. The system itself is the cause of the disaster. The propaganda machine worked overtime to reinforce this denial. Local officials were blamed for failures of execution, while the main leader was always portrayed as unaware of the true horrors or as the last hope to fix them. This creates a psychological shield around the ultimate authority, protecting him from the consequences of his own policies. This clinging to belief is an act of profound self-preservation, but not of the body, of the mind. The person has become so fused with the ideology that to break with it is to suffer an identity crisis, a breakdown of everything they thought they were. They choose to protect their identity as a loyal citizen, even if it means sacrificing their life. The story of the Russian famine is a quiet, devastating lesson in psychological endurance. It shows that once an ideology has deeply rooted itself, the human mind will construct extraordinary defenses to protect it, even against the most powerful, undeniable evidence of reality. This deep-seated will to believe is what keeps a regime standing even after it has visibly failed its people, the Stockholm state and nation's captivity. Tonight we introduce a chilling parallel, the Stockholm Syndrome. This is a psychological phenomenon where people who are kidnapped or held captive begin to develop a bond and even affection for their captor. They start to rationalize the captor's actions, and they come to see the captor as the source of their survival, not their suffering. We can see an entire nation going through this process, a Stockholm state. In a totalitarian regime, the entire population is, in a way, held captive. The state controls every aspect of their life, their job, their food, their speech, and their future. The regime is both the source of all danger and the source of all protection. When a person feels totally helpless, their mind tries to find a way to survive the terror. The psychological trick is this: the mind shifts the source of the suffering. Instead of blaming the captor, the terrible leader, the captive blames the people who try to rescue them, the dissidents or the external critics. The leader is viewed as a complex, demanding figure who is only being harsh because the enemies are forcing his hand. The feeling of small mercies is key. If the leader allows a family to keep their small ration of food, the person feels immense gratitude toward the leader, instead of anger that the leader stole their freedom in the first place. This small act of conditional kindness is magnified 1,000 times over in the mind of the captive population. A nation in this condition often fears freedom more than they fear the tyrant. Freedom means the end of the strict, defined structure, the end of the clear enemy, and the return of the chaotic uncertainty that led to the tyranny in the first place. The psychological dependency on the captor becomes complete. The tragic reality of the Stockholm state is that the nation ends up protecting its own jailer. The people become the enforcers of the very system that enslaves them, all because their minds have been psychologically trained to see the tyrant as the key to their continued existence. This profound, dark dependence is the quiet foundation of long-lasting authoritarian rule. Cognitive dissonance, the mind's self-defense. Imagine you believe two things that cannot both be true at the same time. For example, you believe your leader is good and wise, but you see that his policies are causing suffering. This uncomfortable feeling is called cognitive dissonance. It's a tension in the mind that demands to be resolved. Terrible leaders survive because their followers naturally resolve this tension by rationalizing the leader's actions. The mind hates this dissonance. To resolve it, a person has two choices. They can change their belief about the leader is bad, or they can change their belief about the evidence. The suffering is not the leader's fault. It's a necessary sacrifice. In a state of total obedience, changing your belief about the leader is extremely dangerous, both politically and socially. Therefore, the vast majority of followers choose the second path. They justify the unjustifiable. They tell themselves that the famine is a necessary weeding out of traitors, or that the cruel law is only temporary and will lead to future glory. This act of moral self-deception reduces the dissonance and allows the person to remain a loyal, integrated member of the community. The stronger the original belief and the greater the personal sacrifice made for the system, the more intense the need to justify the actions. If a person has risked their life, betrayed a friend, or spent years shouting slogans, they cannot admit it was for a terrible mistake. That admission would be a psychological catastrophe. The regime helps this process along by providing the ready-made justifications. It's the fault of the old regime. It's the fault of foreign spies. It's a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The followers simply adopt these official rationalizations as their own, effectively outsourcing their moral decision-making to the state. Cognitive dissonance is one of the most powerful and often silent defenses of a tyranny. It shows us that people don't cling to authority despite the suffering. They cling to authority because of the suffering. The greater the pain, the greater the need to believe that the authority who caused it was right all along, It's the mind's self-defense against the trauma of admitting error. The North Korean model, the divine leader. For an extreme modern example of mass obedience, we look at North Korea. Here, the terrible leader is elevated to a status far beyond a mere politician or general. He is the divine leader, a figure of almost religious importance. This absolute deification is a powerful psychological model for ensuring total, unquestioning submission, creating a state built entirely on a single, shared, enforced fantasy. The system is built on absolute isolation. The people have no reliable access to the outside world, meaning the state's narrative is the only reality they will ever know. There is no external truth to check against the leader's claims. This complete control of the information environment is the first step in making the leader godlike. Children are taught that the leader and his family possess superhuman abilities. Stories of miracles and God-given talents replace actual history. This belief system is woven into every aspect of life, from school to work. The leader is not just a ruler. He is the source of all good things, the crops, the sun, the very existence of the nation. This is religious obedience applied to politics. The followers don't just obey laws, they engage in rituals of public adoration. Every gesture, every display of emotion is a carefully choreographed act of reverence. This constant public performance of belief reinforces the idea in everyone's mind. If everyone is acting like the leader is divine, it becomes almost impossible to maintain a private dissenting thought. The system relies on profound, pervasive fear. Questioning the divine leader is not just a crime against the state, it's a blasphemy against the national god. The punishment for deviation is often so harsh that people choose preemptive obedience. They strive to obey perfectly, not out of love, but out of a deep existential terror of the consequences of the slightest error. The North Korean model demonstrates the ultimate outcome of the cult of personality, a state where the tyrant has successfully replaced God, history, and family. The nation is locked in a state of permanent psychological childhood, forever looking up to the omnipotent leader for all life, meaning, and security. Fear as the glue, the politics of terror. If you want a nation to follow you, you can use love, but fear is often a much more reliable tool. The terrible leader uses the politics of terror to maintain control, turning fear into the very glue that holds the obedient state together. This terror is not always loud and dramatic. Often, it is a quiet, constant dread, created by secret police and a pervasive network of informers. The key to this system is unpredictability. People in a terror state don't know who is loyal, who is a spy, or what small innocent action might lead to their arrest. When the rules of survival are constantly shifting and unclear, people choose the safest option: absolute silence and total compliance. They freeze, hoping not to be noticed. This system encourages people to self-police and to police their neighbours. Since everyone is afraid of being reported, the safest thing to do is to be seen reporting on others, or at least to be seen publicly praising the regime. The constant suspicion destroys social trust and breaks down any natural resistance that might arise from collective action. The state only needs to make a few, highly publicized examples of cruelty. These acts, known as show trials or public purges, send a clear message. No one is safe. No one is too important to be destroyed. This keeps the overall level of fear high, ensuring that passive compliance remains the most rational survival strategy for the individual. This fear is often internalized. The person becomes their own jailer. They filter their own thoughts, censure their own words, and choose their friends based on their perceived loyalty. This internalized oppression means the state does less physical work. The fear does the psychological work of control for them. Ultimately, the politics of terror is a profound psychological victory for the tyrant. It turns a nation of potential individuals into a mass of isolated, self-censoring people who cling to the source of their terror, the leader, because they believe he is the only one who can grant them a temporary conditional reprieve from the fear he created. The greater good, fallacy, moral self-deception. When terrible leaders ask their people to commit terrible acts or endure immense suffering, they don't ask them to be cruel. They ask them to be noble. They use the concept of the greater good, the idea that any suffering today is a necessary, even heroic sacrifice for a glorious, perfect future. This is the moral self-deception that allows otherwise decent people to participate in great injustice. The leader tells the followers that their current suffering is not a sign of failure, but a test of their virtue and commitment. This gives meaning to the pain. If a person is cold, hungry, or working impossibly hard, they can tell themselves, "I am not suffering pointlessly. I am sacrificing for the national destiny." This belief is psychologically comforting. The regime makes the greater good seem huge and abstract. World revolution, racial purity, national glory. Because the goal is so grand and vague, any small concrete cruelty, like arresting a neighbour or silencing a doubt, can be justified as a necessary step toward the ultimate shining ideal. The end, they believe, absolutely justifies the means. This fallacy relieves the individual of immediate moral burden. If a soldier is told to shoot an innocent person, he doesn't see himself as a murderer. He sees himself as a tool for securing the future perfection of the state. He substitutes the difficult present reality with the simple, glorious, promised reality. This belief is reinforced by the leader's own apparent devotion. The leader often portrays himself as the greatest sacrificer of all, the most overworked and dedicated servant of the greater good. This illusion makes the followers feel that their own small sacrifices are both necessary and appreciated by a noble figure. The tragedy of the greater good fallacy is that it provides a powerful, ready-made moral defense for people who participate in cruelty. It turns the worst act into acts of virtue and obedience into a form of moral heroism. It's the ultimate psychological loophole that allows a nation to march toward a catastrophe while genuinely believing they are building a utopia. Mussolini's march, the allure of action. After the chaos of World War I, Italy was a country tired of slow debate, weak leadership, and confusing politics. Into this vacuum stepped Benito Mussolini, promising not just order, but forceful, immediate action. His rise is a case study in how a leader who promises muscular, decisive movement appeals to a population utterly exhausted by the complex failures of slow, deliberative democracy. Mussolini's movement, fascism, was defined by its rejection of talk in favour of doing. His rhetoric was all about speed, strength, and national virility. This contrasted sharply with the image of the previous timid government. For a population feeling humiliated and weak, a leader who appears strong, decisive, and ready to break the rules is incredibly appealing. The allure of action is a profound psychological pull. Complexity is draining, simplicity is refreshing. Mussolini offered a simple vision, the restoration of the glory of the Roman Empire. This grand, simple narrative replaced the frustrating, complicated present-day problems. People traded the difficulty of thinking for the ease of marching. The theatrical displays of fascism, the black shirts, the synchronized marching, the aggressive salutes, were not just political theatre. They were designed to create a feeling of collective power and unbreakable momentum. Being a part of this visible, strong movement was psychologically intoxicating, giving the individual a feeling of strength they lacked alone. The terrible leader becomes the ultimate doer. He cuts through bureaucracy, silences dissent immediately, and makes clear, swift decisions. Even if the decisions are wrong, the act of deciding provides a deep psychological comfort to the nation tired of indecision. The people are happy to let him take the wheel, simply because they are exhausted from navigating the chaos themselves. Mussolini's march shows us that the psychology of fatigue is a tyrant's best friend. When people are tired, They will follow the loudest voice that promises to make them feel energetic and strong again. The promise of decisive action, regardless of its morality, is a powerful antidote to a nation's weariness. The silent majority, the bystander effect state. When an injustice happens in a crowded place, sometimes no one helps. Everyone assumes someone else will step in. This is called the bystander effect. In a totalitarian state, this becomes the bystander effect state, where the responsibility to stop the cruelty is diffused across millions of people, leading to widespread collective inaction against clear injustice. This silent majority is the fuel for the tyrant's machinery. The tyrant doesn't need everyone to be an active supporter. He just needs the vast majority to be passive. When people see their neighbour being arrested or a cruel law being passed, their first thought is, someone else will surely stop this, or it's not my problem. This act of psychological distancing is a form of self-preservation. The state deliberately encourages this feeling of isolation. By making an example of anyone who speaks out, the leader sends the message, your personal action is futile and highly dangerous. This ensures that people retreat into their private lives and prioritize the safety of their own families over the general welfare of society. The problem is that when everyone is waiting for someone else to act, no one acts. The silent majority, by its very silence, provides a powerful form of implicit approval for the regime. The government can claim that the absence of protest is evidence of overwhelming national support. This passive compliance allows terrible things to be done in broad daylight. The followers become skilled in the art of looking away. They see the hardship, they hear the injustice, but their survival instinct tells them to keep their head down, stay quiet, and pretend the system is working. This is the psychology of resignation. The bystander effect state reveals the devastating power of collective inertia. It shows that tyranny doesn't necessarily rely on the passion of its followers, but on the quiet, exhausted apathy of its non-followers. The terrible leader wins because the great mass of people chooses safety and silence over the danger of moral responsibility. Trauma and memory, rewriting the past. To control a nation's future, a terrible leader must first control its past. This means systematically destroying or rewriting historical memory. If the state can convince the followers that history was different, they remove any objective benchmark for judging the present reality. The leader wants the population to live in a state of permanent psychological amnesia. The state eliminates any stories, monuments, or books that contradict the official narrative. The old heroes are erased. The new heroes, the leader and his allies, are magnified. The history taught in schools is a simple, clean, and often completely false story that always leads perfectly to the leader's necessary rise to power. This is a deep psychological attack. When people no longer trust their own memory of past events, they become entirely dependent on the state's version of reality. They start to doubt whether the old times were as good as they thought, or whether the current difficulties are truly a deviation from the norm. The truth is replaced by the official myth. By rewriting history, the leader makes his rule seem inevitable and necessary. He wasn't just a man who seized power, he was the destined culmination of the nation's entire historical struggle. This narrative gives a profound, almost religious legitimacy to his rule, and makes opposition seem like a foolish attempt to fight the natural course of history. The fear of being wrong is a powerful motivator. If you publicly remember a truth that the state says is false, you risk being labelled delusional or a fabricator. People quickly learn to adopt the official memory to protect their social standing and their sanity, making the lie a collective enforced truth. The systematic control of trauma and memory is the final stage of psychological colonization. The leader doesn't just control the people's actions, he controls their very sense of time and reality. A nation without an objective past is a nation that cannot rationally judge its present, leaving it forever trapped in the tyrant's perpetual narrative. The economic anchor, bread and circuses. In ancient Rome, the rulers kept the people happy with bread and circuses, free food and entertaining games, Terrible leaders today use a similar method, creating an economic anchor that binds the population to the regime. They provide a basic, often minimal level of security or material gain that makes the thought of challenging the leader too economically terrifying to consider. This isn't about creating a wealthy society, it's about creating an economically dependent one. The state becomes the sole provider of jobs, housing, and social services. This means that losing your job, your home, or your child's education is an immediate, catastrophic risk, and all of these things are entirely controlled by the ruling party. This dependence is a profound psychological restraint. People are willing to overlook the cruelty and the political repression because the material cost of dissent is too high. It's a pragmatic calculation. I may not like the leader, but if I speak out, my family will starve. Therefore, I must be loyal. The leader also uses public works and grand projects to create the illusion of massive prosperity and progress. Even if the individual's life is hard, they see the huge dams, the new highways, or the massive statues, and they think, the system must be working despite my current difficulties. This creates a powerful cognitive disconnect. The state ensures that even small private commerce is difficult without party approval. This extends the economic web of control to every single person. The terrible leader becomes the gatekeeper of all resources, and the only path to a stable life is through unwavering political submission. The economic anchor is one of the quietest and most effective forms of control. It demonstrates that the threat of poverty and instability can be a far greater motivator for obedience than the direct threat of the prison. The followers cling to the leader because materially they have been left with no other choice for survival, from revolution to tyranny. The paradox of hope. Revolutions are often driven by a powerful feeling of hope for freedom, equality, and a better future. Yet time and again we see the leaders of these revolutions quickly turning into the very tyrants they replaced. This is the paradox of hope, the painful process where the desire for freedom is immediately subverted by a new authority, promising absolute, immediate stability. After the intense, dangerous chaos of a revolution, the population is emotionally and physically drained. They have fought, sacrificed, and endured deep disorder. The new leaders know that the people's greatest desire is not for more fighting or difficult debate, but for a swift, simple return to order. The revolutionary leader, now in power, often uses the very language of freedom to justify his new dictatorship. He argues that the revolutionary ideals are too fragile to withstand debate or opposition. Therefore, a temporary strong hand is necessary to protect the gains of the revolution from hidden enemies and internal strife. This psychological argument works because the followers genuinely fear the return of the old system or the descent back into chaos. They see the strong leader as the guardian of their hope, even as he systematically dismantles the freedoms they just fought for. The end of the fight is more appealing than the difficulty of building a real democracy. The leader consolidates power by portraying all former allies who disagree with him as traitors to the revolution. This psychological tactic effectively silences dissent by branding it as a betrayal of the very ideals they all fought for. This is a profound and cruel form of moral co-option. The paradox of hope is a sorrowful lesson in political psychology. It demonstrates that the emotional high of fighting for freedom is often quickly replaced by the exhaustion of maintaining it, and that a nation, once freed, can quickly surrender itself to the next strong figure who promises an easy, immediate peace. The role of the intellectual, justifying the unjustifiable. When a terrible leader comes to power, they need more than just brute force. They need intellectual justification. They need educated elites, professors, writers, and thinkers to provide the sophisticated moral and philosophical framework that legitimizes the tyranny. This co-option of the intellectual class is crucial for convincing the educated public and future generations of the rightness of the authoritarian regime. These intellectuals perform a vital psychological function. They make the simple, often crude ideology of the leader sound complex, noble, and necessary. They invent grand theories about history, race, or economics that explain why the leader's brutality is actually a form of higher virtue or scientific necessity. For the public, the presence of these educated voices provides a huge source of reassurance. If the cleverest people in the country are supporting the leader, then the average person feels safe in their own loyalty. The intellectual support acts as a social permission, slip for mass obedience and moral compromise. For the intellectuals themselves, the temptation is strong. The regime offers them power, status, and the resources to finally see their theories put into real-world action. Many convince themselves that by participating, they can somehow moderate the leader or guide the worst tendencies. This is often a fatal delusion. Those who refuse to conform are swiftly and publicly silenced. This sends a powerful message to all academics. Your choice is either to lend your prestige and intellect to the service of the state, or to become a non-person. The threat ensures that most choose the path of intellectual servitude. The co-option of the intellectual demonstrates a powerful psychological truth. Tyranny is not just a triumph of force, but a triumph of rationalization. By borrowing the language of science, philosophy, and history, the terrible leader can cloak his most hateful acts in a veil of scholarly legitimacy, making the terrible journey seem entirely logical. The exit problem, the fear of starting over. Imagine you've walked a very long way down a winding, difficult road, only to realize the road sign at the end points to a dangerous cliff. You have a choice: admit the whole journey was a mistake and face the difficult path back, or desperately keep walking and pretend the cliff isn't there. This is the exit problem, the deep human aversion to admitting a colossal error. For followers of a terrible leader, the psychological difficulty of admitting failure is immense. They have often spent years sacrificing, fighting, and building their entire social identity around the regime's ideology. To suddenly admit the leader was wrong would mean acknowledging that those years of their life were wasted, meaningless, or evil. This fear of a total identity collapse often outweighs the visible evidence of the regime's failures. It is simply too painful, too overwhelming, for the mind to process the total destruction of its own belief system. So, the individual chooses perseverance in the error, rather than the crushing weight of admitting the truth. The state uses this deep-seated fear to its advantage. It makes the personal cost of leaving the ideology so high, through social shunning, economic ruin, or arrest, that the individual finds it safer to remain in a state of active self-deception. The tyranny is maintained by the people's own psychological need for consistency. The exit problem also affects the nation's political elite. Once a high-ranking official has participated in the regime's crimes, they are tied to the leader by shared guilt. They cannot defect without facing justice for their own actions, ensuring their continued desperate loyalty to the system that protects them. Ultimately, this chapter on the fear of starting over teaches us a profound lesson in human psychology. Change is hard, even when the status quo is terrible. The powerful psychological pull of maintaining consistency and avoiding the humiliation of error is a silent, tragic mechanism that keeps populations locked in the orbit of destructive authority. The fragility of freedom. A history of apathy. Freedom, it turns out, is incredibly fragile. It doesn't defend itself. The slow erosion of liberty is often not the result of a single violent assault, but a quiet, patient process that relies entirely on public apathy. This chapter explores how the lack of active participation and a decline in civic vigilance can leave the door wide open for authoritarianism to slowly, almost invisibly, creep in. The leader does not take all freedoms at once. He takes them one small law, one minor censorship, one single dismissed judge at a time. Each step is small enough to avoid a massive popular reaction. The people think, it's only a small change, and it's not worth the trouble of a fight. This gradual, incremental seizure of power is the psychology of the slow boil. The problem is the decline of civic virtue. True freedom requires constant active participation, voting, debating, monitoring power, and speaking out. When people become too busy, too distracted by entertainment, or simply too cynical about politics, they retreat into their private concerns. This political exhaustion is the tyrant's greatest ally. The leader knows that distraction is a form of control. By encouraging a focus on consumerism, sports, or endless digital entertainment, the state can keep the population busy and diverted from the serious business of questioning power. A distracted mind is an unvigilant mind. When dissent is silenced, the public sphere becomes cold and empty. People stop discussing serious matters because they fear the consequences. The great danger is that the capacity for collective action slowly atrophies. When the moment finally comes that requires a massive, unified stand, the people have forgotten how to act together. The fragility of freedom is a quiet warning from history. The terrible leader doesn't necessarily defeat the nation's liberties. The nation often simply neglects them. The price of freedom is not just blood, it is constant attentive vigilance. A nation that is politically apathetic is a nation that is psychologically preparing itself for submission. Breaking the spell. Moments of mass awakening. Despite all the psychological tools a terrible leader uses, fear, propaganda, economic control, the spell is not permanent. History holds moments of profound shared psychological shift. The mass awakening, where widespread obedience finally fractures and the collective narrative of the tyranny collapses. This is the moment when people suddenly refine their own eyes and see the tyrant for who he is. The awakening rarely happens all at once. It often begins with a single, undeniable event. A military defeat, a sudden economic collapse, or a moment of extreme, unjustified cruelty that is too big or too public to be rationalized away. This single crack in the system allows the accumulated cognitive dissonance to finally spill out. When the spell breaks, the fear that enforced the obedience often transforms into righteous anger. People realize they were not just victims of the tyrant, but also victims of their own passive compliance. This shared feeling of betrayal and humiliation fuels a massive, sudden desire for retribution and change. Crucially, the awakening requires one or a few brave individuals to publicly break the silence. When one person stands up and says, "The leader is naked," the effect on the silent, doubting majority is electric. It gives others the social permission they needed to articulate their own long-suppressed private doubts. The collapse of the tyrant's authority is often surprisingly swift. The same psychological pressure that enforced unity suddenly works in reverse, enforcing mass rejection. The officials, police and soldiers who were only obeying out of fear quickly abandon the sinking ship, eager to align themselves with the new, emerging power of the people. The mass awakening is a powerful testament to the ultimate resilience of the human spirit. It shows that while the mind can be temporarily captured by fear and propaganda, the inner need for truth and dignity can never be completely extinguished. Even the most ironclad systems of totalitarian control can be shattered by the simple, collective act of remembering the truth. The path forward, vigilance, and the mind's defences. We've reached the end of our journey through the psychology of obedience. The history we've reviewed offers not just tales of the past, but vital lessons for the future. The final, most important lesson is this: vigilance is the only defense. We must actively train our minds to recognize and resist the subtle, compelling appeals of corrosive authority before the spell of mass delusion can ever take hold. The first step in vigilance is the active rejection of certainty. When a leader offers a solution that is too simple, too fast, and too perfect, that is the most dangerous moment. We must cultivate a deep-seated comfort with complexity, doubt, and debate. Truth is often messy and difficult. The lie is always simple and comforting. We must protect our critical thinking at all costs. This means constantly seeking information from diverse, reliable sources and practicing the difficult habit of questioning what we are told, even if the source seems legitimate. The ability to think independently is the single greatest psychological defense against all forms of propaganda. We must nurture social trust beyond the party line. The terrible leader seeks to isolate us and destroy the bonds of community. Our willingness to talk honestly with our neighbours, to defend the rights of the minority, and to show empathy for the outgroup is an act of political resistance. Community is the antidote to authoritarian isolation. Remember the banality of evil. Great cruelty is often done by small, ordinary steps. We must refuse to participate in the small acts of moral compromise, the just following orders that slowly normalize the terrible system. Individual moral courage, even in a small moment, is the seed of national resistance. History shows us that the battle against tyranny is fought first and foremost within the human mind. By understanding the psychological gravity of obedience, the seductive power of charisma, and the comfort of the lie, we arm ourselves with the knowledge necessary to protect our own intellectual freedom. This quiet understanding is the path forward to a more resilient, vigilant society. As you drift off tonight, let these stories settle in your subconscious. They are not just tales of the past, they are warnings for the future. If this journey through the shadowed corners of the human psyche has given you pause, please tap the subscribe button and the bell icon. Joining the psychological historian community means committing to the quiet vigilance necessary to keep the past from becoming the present. Now, let's continue. History, it turns out, is not just a ledger of events, but a profound record of human psychology. These echoes of obedience, fear, and manufactured belief remind us that the greatest battle for freedom is often fought not on a battlefield, but within the confines of our own minds. Thank you for joining me on this quiet, reflective journey. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with lucid, vigilant thought. Good night.